All right, is he still here? Yes. So, we have to have, like I said, we have to have, if we have these three conditions, what needs to change? And how do we enact the change? How do we decide change? Now, Rome did this pretty effectively, right? If you needed, they were at war, they would establish somebody, basically a dictator. The dictator wasn't had certain powers, right, to organize the state for war, and then they transitioned back out of that process when the war was over. They had a similar process for festivals. If they had a lot of wealth come in, it was sort of expected that this wealth would be shared with the community. And so that's when they would have their triumphs and all this other nonsense and celebration. They also had periods of adjustment, which we think of as the Roman reforms, where things have gotten out of hand and they need reorganization. Well, that's like something between war and going concern. There's a problem that needs to be fixed. Then what happens is if we fail to adapt, right?
Well, then we get a Caesar.
Yeah. Do we have that in there? Failure to adapt generates demand for authority. Ooh.
Is there value here in more disambiguating that? Like, to me, there's a notion here that is on my mind, which is that basically you generate incentives at the top that are supplanting the incentives that were there previously, that were shared between leadership and the rest of the population. So it's an insulation from the externalities that affect the population disproportionately. And an insulation from the consequences of the actions of the leadership.
So can you say it again, because I want to get it in this plan.
I don't feel I have it entirely operationalized yet, but
Try it again.
what I'm saying is
I
that
just, I can't. I was trying to do two things at once, and I almost had it, and I couldn't quite do it.
yeah. So the creation of a particular institutional structure, which is being played out over time, ends up generating separate incentives for the leadership from those incentives of the population, and it also insulates the leadership from criticism and externalities that their actions produce that disproportionately affect those that have to bear costs on the behalf of the leadership, but not the leadership itself. So if they institute some different monetary policy, or if they raise higher taxes, they generally don't tend to pay those costs themselves. It's the population that pays the costs. Whatever policy you want to talk about, but I'm interested in just saying that there's the incentives of the leadership no longer coincide with the incentives of the incentives facing the total population, and their interests diverge because they start to have status as the leadership rather than heroism in contribution, in pursuit of contribution to the commons. Which I think what we talked about one of the other times guards against, which is that duty to create your own replacement, to train the people that are your charges in the exercise of the duty that you are and the responsibility that you're exercising. I mean, here's the other way to say that. The leadership starts to have incentives that rely on manipulating the social fabric rather than the actual physical distribution and creation and distribution of goods. They start to have to invest in. I mean, this is basically the driver of degeneracy, right? Degeneracy is what happens in late stage empire, where this people defend their status regardless of cost to the social fabric that status exists within. They externalize the cost of the creation of the status onto the health of the collective status regime. The signals, the virtue signaling.
Yeah, I'm trying to get it. One more time.
Okay, at scale, you have to rely on symbols to facilitate the flow of information, the flow of resources, the flow of all kinds of things in a large scale system. Then people start to relate to the manipulation of the symbols more than the actual flow of value that those symbols are supposed to facilitate. In the linguistic realm, that's basically the pursuit and defense of status, regardless of cost, to the fundamental productiveness of what that status is supposed to be based on, which is contribution to the commons. Heroism in pursuit to the contribution to the commons. And to me, that is directly related to the ambiguation of a standard by which standard of weights and measures by which to judge people in positions of authority. When there's no shared standard of weights and measures by which to judge the exercise of duty in a role of responsibility, then the bearer of that responsibility in that role can assert anything they want as being dutiful execution of the role.
Well, we're in a context. The context is the failure of adaptation.
Yes, and I'm saying that what I'm describing is a way that we fail to is the
Right.
the way that
Let me just look at-
Yeah.
So we can do that by a failure of cooperation, a failure of capital, or the failure of the persistence of evolutionary quantification. But this is basically is a short, medium, and long term.
I guess on the tip of my tongue, but continue.
I don't know why I'm having trouble getting this fucking cursor to move around. You keep referring to is a breakdown in what? What's breaking down? And so what I hear is I almost got it. You think you could do it again?
Yeah, I'll try another approach.
Okay.
So part of this is informed by my study of the discipline of currency design. And we had a lot of conversation yesterday here talking about starting from that video that I mentioned and then going into currency design basically. And one of the primary criticisms that art makes of the token land token understanding in the crypto world is that it mistakes the flow of the tokens for the valuable thing. That's not the valuable thing. The tokens are only valuable insofar as they facilitate the flow of actual creation of resources or meaningful exchange of information or creation of relationships that are productive. And so this, to me, is a similar kind of misunderstanding and is also indicated by the phenomenon of the breakdown of adaptation, which happens when we lose the ability to judge at the margins. We lose decidability at the margins in terms of judging whether a particular action or act is furthering capitalization or furthering adaptation or not.
Mm.
And so instead of being able to actually judge that directly, we relate to the proximal measures we have that we rely on to indicate that.
Yeah.
And that in the case of crypto, that's the tokens. In the case of law, it's the permission from the leader or the assertion about what the thing should be, what kind of thing should be done. And so it's basically a failure to maintain the ability to have decidability at the margins. And that happens when somebody can leverage status to ambiguate what their role is, what the criteria are by which they perform that role, and therefore they can basically make their own environment. They can create their own environment in which they're judged, or rather not judged at all, because they are the status holders, and anything they say now goes. This is most I think easily seen in the Chinese civilization at the moment, where Xi, as Peter Zeihan says, having cut out all the potential critics in his political organization in the Communist Party, and therefore there's no more any adaptation loop at the top of the civilization at all, meaning that they are bound to, by evolutionary computation as a principle, to fail to compute anything resembling adaptation at the top level down, which then dooms the entire social body to large-scale failure, which will result in millions and millions of people dying in short timeframes. So in the West, we prioritize lots of conflict early, conflict often,
Yes.
so that we can pay the cost in the time frame that the conflict or the divergence appears. In China, Chinese civilization, they do the opposite.
Yeah.
And so, but even still, there are larger and smaller cycles in which we even identify that there's a conflict, or people abuse the ability that they have to determine the things that other people pay attention to advantage themselves over the health of the collective that they're supposedly a part of, because factional incentives start to replace civilizational incentives.
All right, okay, so what I'm trying to figure out, as I was able to listen carefully that time, for some reason, the political system can't perform.
Ah.
I have to define that. The generation of demand for authority is a breakdown, right? The capture of by a class causing disproportionate rewards, right? And then I think you're saying there's another one here, which is captured by the class. But I can't find out how anything could be different between I don't like color here.
I guess what I'm speaking to is it's a pattern that happens at various levels of scale. And so it's not a single phenomenon. So like it happens in any organization, just the ability of the organization to adapt fails. And I'm pointing out one mechanism by which that fails.
And what's that
Uh,
mechanism?
That mechanism is that the incentives of a subgroup start to become divorced from the adaptation of the overall collective that that subgroup is a part of, because the incentives, the local incentives of that subgroup for each of the subgroup's members start to outweigh the incentives that the overall group that subgroup is a part of is itself exposed to, and therefore a subgroup that is part of the larger group starts to perceive the group that it's reliant on, that's a part of, as its environment that it's competing within and that it extracts resources from, with no eye towards the externalities that it produces while doing so, and with no check on that. And this is just a failure of institution building that maintains the ability to continuously deconstruct and reconstruct legitimacy, authority, social structure that is adaptive.
We're trying to reduce it to a first principle. The inability of political reform causing illegitimacy. The generation of divergent incentives because of the illegitimacy. The divergence, the generation of demand for authority, are captured by a class.
Yeah, I almost don't see how
Disproportionately between class and factor. Class
I
return.
don't see how to prevent it other than force indoctrination even on the elites.
Well, I don't either, but the point is, this is as far as I know, the escalation path.
I mean, we know how to prevent it, which is, well, not prevent it, but rather how to systematically eradicate it after the first occurrence, which is the law. But we're talking about how the first instance gets generated. And for some reason, the notion you've often talked about, just markets and everything, comes up for me here. Like if you underspecify the rules of a market for performance within the context of the civilization in whatever social function, if you underspecify it, then market competitors, market participants will will come up against the edges of that specification, if you will, or underspecification, and start to just move the market in their favor with nobody else able to see and coordinate against their abuse of the unspecified rules.
Because I am not doing well here. And you made me think hard. I was doing fine before I had to think hard.
I apologize for doing my duty.
Dick. I'm gonna crash, I think.
Yeah, I think this is a really hard part because there's such a large
It's
set
so
of
hard because
variables.
I fucking can't think straight. So, where are you? Oh,